We are so glad you joined us today to get centered, but we have a disclaimer. Being centered really is more of an aspiration than a destination. This is a vodcast where we'll be discussing all things mind and body, mental health, physical well-being, parenting, marriage, healthy touch, anger and how to handle it. What is integrative medicine? How do I meditate? What are we learning from COVID in this quarantine experience? Where do we go from here? You have questions on these topics, and we ask those same questions ourselves. So this isn't a vodcast full of answers. It's one full of discussion, because we're going to tell you right now we do not have all the answers, but we do love a rich discussion and hope you do too. We're Leila Scott and John Price, the founders of the Center for Healing Arts and Sciences, and this vodcast is hosted by our amazing team, which is comprised of an integrative group of therapists offering individual, couples, family, depth therapy, and offers support groups for men, women, teens, young professionals, and others. Chinese medicine practitioners offering acupuncture, herbal medicine, food therapy, lifestyle advice, and last but not least, our mindfulness meditation and spirituality guide. Be sure to reach out to us to let us know other topics you'd like to hear us discuss, or to let us know if you'd like to work with our integrative team. We are here for you and offering virtual care as well as home delivery of wellness self-care packages during this time of physical separation. Give us a shout at 713-526-4444 and be sure to follow us on social at Center for HAS. And now, please enjoy the show.
Well, hello and welcome back for those of you watching and those of you here today joining us on Zoom. Hello to everybody. We started a thread. We started talking last week about anxiety, and so it seemed kind of natural to begin talking about depression this week. So what we'd like to do is start by framing how depression is viewed conceptually from a clinical lens with everybody's different disciplines that they draw from. So I just want to begin by saying, from your perspective, what is depression? And then a follow-up question is, how do you frame that? And how do you start to work with depression? So let's start with the first part. What is depression? And who wants to go first?
I would say, and probably along the same lines of where you would go with that, is that it's about where the energy is headed. Because if we have energy in our lives, in the way that we are interacting both with ourselves and with our environment, then that's all going outward. If the energy is not available anymore, then it's almost like an autoimmune disease where the available energy is actually dragging down and depressing our own system. So it's a matter of establishing a relationship with whatever that energy is and what it's where it's trying to take us.
And what do you see as far as symptoms, Rodney? What does that look like in actuals?
In actuals, I think it means very little interest in engaging externally, and things that were once pleasurable have sort of lost their the ability to enliven the way we feel.
Yeah, I mean, because if we looked in the diagnostic manual, what we'd see is things like eating too much or too little, sleeping too much or too little, losing interest in things that used to give a sense of joy and purpose, a sense of lethargy. I think what people do when they come into our offices, at least in my office, is they describe it using different terminology. Of course, they'll say things like, "I feel stuck," "I'm feeling a sense of hopelessness and fear," "I just have this low-grade melancholia or sadness," "I can't seem to get over things," "I'm raw." One interesting piece when it comes to depression, certainly in men, is that a typical symptom of depression is irritation and irritability. So what can happen is that the psyche, rather than actually feeling what those feelings are, like a certain aggression, prevents the individual or maintains the perspective that they don't want to move into some of those feelings. So we tend to look at depression as melancholia, but it can look all kinds of different ways. It can look like addiction. It can look like relationship issues. It can look like radical changes in areas of interest. It can look like changes of peer group or changes of just the way somebody's living their lives. But the main descriptor that I hear is hopelessness and stuckness. What do you guys hear? Anything to add to that?
Well, finally, oh, sorry.
You go ahead, Hannah.
Oh, thanks. So yeah, I think that there's the description's twofold, right? I mean, we have that DSM listing of all the symptomology, but I really like what Rodney had mentioned about relationships, because to me, at least from that MFT standpoint, it's almost like a loss of connection, whether it's a loss of connection with yourself, a loss of connection with others, sometimes even, like you said, a loss of connection with just a sense of liveliness, because you feel, whether it's so numb or so overwhelmed with such intense emotions that you don't know what to do with it. So I think that's such an important component too, that even though there are those symptoms that you could WebMD, I mean, there's so much more complexity to it. And I think that's why it is still something that can be so misconstrued and misunderstood. And that's why we have all these different movies and TV shows that try to help people understand what depression is, what suicide is, what all these different levels and subsets of it, because there are different intensities of it, right? And just because somebody might have a more mild case doesn't mean it's not as important to address and talk about.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too, is that it's important to acknowledge that it is such a spectrum, and I can speak openly. I'm familiar with depression myself. I mean, I've had periods of time where I could not get up off the ground. I had to have somebody call me every morning to hold me accountable to getting out of bed, like I understand that feeling. And yet I think it's really important to remember that it is an accumulation of symptoms. Yes, we do need to understand that sometimes it's so severe that it needs medication. We need severe intervention. But I think that if it's not that, if it's anything prior to that level of intensity, we need to remember that pathologizing it is not going to be helpful. Every peak has its valley. It's all telling us something. And like Rodney said, it's energy and it's pointing an arrow somewhere. So if we could just follow the arrow and see where it's trying to take us, there's something for us to learn, something to be gained from going deep, as opposed to just trying to exit as quickly as possible from the discomfort.
Yeah, I see it in my own view. I'm not a therapist, but I see it as depression, and I think last week we talked about anxiety, and so I see those both as a similar force, in that they're kind of both energetically backwards facing in some way, even though they're kind of, it's interesting because you think that they're forward facing, but they're really kind of saying, whatever my past is, I assume that is what future will be. So it's like kind of a reference, using the reference of the past to determine what the future will be, even though we really, none of us really know that. So when you're depressed, you're thinking that the horrible things that have happened will continue to happen, and then if you're anxious, you're thinking the horrible things that have happened will continue to happen, right? Either way, it's a kind of a bogging down of getting stuck not here, right? It's like, it's just not being present with what actually is, and not being open to the fact that the future, first of all, we really don't know. None of us really know. And second of all, the future might actually be better, right? It might be nothing like the past at all, right? So for me, that's kind of the framework that I use, is where both of them, in both cases, we're getting stuck in the past and trying to anticipate a future that we really don't have any business anticipating.
That is something that's important, Ariel, I think, and I'm so careful because there are so many different individual experiences of this. So we're trying to speak universally about something that's very particular and specific for each individual's life. So with that disclaimer, we're going to kind of meander through this territory, and knowing that we can't cover all the different manifestations of the ways in which this shows up in our individual lives. But we do know that there is, by the symptoms that people report, I guess one of the best frameworkings I've ever heard for depression is that it's a disordered, hyphenated, disordered imagination. Like our capacity to imagine something different, something new, kind of what you're saying, Ariel, is you're kind of locked in this, what Freud called the repetitive compulsion, some kind of a patterned way of approaching one's life. And because of that, the hole that pattern is, we just can't simply see another way out of it. And then whenever anybody introduces an idea of maybe handling things differently, it's defended against, because there's something this is a, what do they say? Like, I'd rather have the devil I know over the devil I don't, so that I kind of stay in this patterned way of being and can't see any way out. And even when people come close, it's those individuals that are kind of pushed away that possibly are activating some healing. But the psyche is kind of oriented to just staying in this familiar, because the unknown is actually to hope or to consider a different reality.
Well, and I can't go super deep into the topic. I'm not a scientist who completely understands all the neurotransmitters, but we have to remember that we're fighting an uphill battle at that point. We have a sea of chemicals in our body that is not optimized for feeling balanced, feeling like getting up off the floor, feeling like calling a friend, feeling like doing an act of service, feeling like going and cultivating something beautiful, which would be the exact thing that would pull us out of the tailspin. So of course that suggestion is not well met,
Right.
by the person who's suffering, and that's why I'm a big fan of if somebody can have access to neurotransmitter testing, to just see what that profile looks like at the moment. A lot of people, and there's no shame in having to take a medication if needed, but a lot of people can supplement with the correct neurotransmitters for themselves and balance out nicely, and then you have this nice meeting place of being able to experience the depression and whatever it was telling you, where those arrows were pointing, what did you need to look at? But then you have the energy and the self-collection to be able to do something with that information.
And that's actually one of the biggest scientific points about intervening on depression, is that all the research suggests that it's a mixture of medication and some kind of, whether it's, the studies that I've been reading are saying, of course, talk therapy, but medication and some kind of healing intervention that helps support the system. And medication can only do so much to bring you up to a level to begin then to kind of do the psychological work or the biological work. What ends up happening, and I don't have these statistics here, but I know there are a lot, is that people tend to just take the medicine, but they don't do anything else.
Mm-hmm.
So because what I think tends to be associated with this and is some kind of trauma. We have a trauma with the way that we've envisioned our bodies and our feelings and our emotions and the expression of those emotions and certain limitations to how we can do those. And we carry that habit with us. And of course, that's just the pool we're dipped in. And so we can't see outside of that space. And so we continue doing that. And it does take a meaningful connected relationship, some kind of religious endeavor, community, to then help support the individual getting a bit deeper, and to almost to say, like, hey, we've done this before, you can do it too. Let's dig into what's actually happening, and you may come out with something really meaningful to contribute, whether it's art or a new insight or a new perspective or even a new way of living. Because oftentimes what depression is telling us, that the roles that we're living out aren't really serving our deeper self. And so we need to take a look at how we can actually embody those roles in a new way.
Right. And to your point about, trauma is, there's of course historical trauma that we live with and maybe haven't fully processed, but there's also, people who are just grieving. They've lost a loved one, and they're walking through the mires of that. And, unfortunately, I think sometimes a physician of one kind or another will just try to help them out of that by giving them the medication, as opposed to understanding they could direct them towards somebody to work with for the depth therapy and mindfulness, et cetera, just ways to process what they are going through. And, what we see, I think each of us as clinicians, is that when somebody does choose to medicate in that kind of case, where it's not a clinical issue where they need to be intervened with in that way, is that the fire is waiting for them. They can put it off, but as we all know, the universe will continue to present us what we don't want to look at. And a lot of times it can be even harder to deal with when put off. And then sometimes you have to put it off because it's too intense. You can't deal with, like we've talked about before, somebody who's got to drink, they've got to get drunk to get to the next day. So I don't know.
This makes me think of the conversation we had a few weeks back about how our brain is deceiving us all the time, right? Because there's that biological component where maybe we genuinely have low serotonin levels, right? And we need to medicate with that. But then there's also that cognitive point. I always like to point out to my clients that, let's say if you're looking for a red car, it's easy to spot a red car and ignore the yellow one that was driving by. Or for example, like, I don't know, on Instagram, right? We have all these filters. If we just keep focusing on this one filter, we forget that there's other viewpoints to access. And that's why it's so important to kind of use that culmination of the two. But again, right, depending on the severity, doing, let's say, like cognitive behavioral therapy might not be the case. Maybe it's just somebody needing empathy and validation and compassion, right? I know we've talked about mindfulness in that sense of just learning how to even love and accept yourself, that we are all flawed human beings and we're all trying to navigate our way through all these crises that just naturally arise out of life that aren't fair, but we have to learn to cope with them because there is another side to things. Life is worth it. Life is a beautiful journey on its highs and lows.
Yeah, but I get stuck with folks too. These are really difficult situations that sometimes I totally understand the hopelessness.
Mm-hmm.
There's a difference between, Rodney sent a paper that I thought was a really nice read, and we've been talking about the difference between neurotic and authentic suffering. And that there are, when somebody kind of quote comes into my office, the neurotic suffering is really easy. I say easy, is I'm trained to frame that, because what I'm looking for are the kind of historical or cultural or embodied ways of these patterns manifesting, and we can kind of begin to shift those little by little through the relationship. But when you're just talking about genuine, authentic suffering, those are the moments that we just sit with each other, and it's difficult and horrendous, and that substance gets on you when you're with it, and our ability to understand what's happening to us as we're feeling a sense of hopelessness along with somebody. I think that's something that a lot of people withdraw from. And so when somebody is in that state, it's, I want to stay away. I don't like the way I feel when I'm there. And again, that perpetuates the cycle when what we really need are people to sit with us and not say anything or do anything, but just be with us as we're in pain. Mm-hmm. And that natural support is something that can be very healing. But so often we don't do a very good job of noticing that to truly empathize is to really feel what they're feeling. And so to feel a sense of hopelessness is hopeless. That's scary.
Yeah. For me, I'll say that one of the ways we work with difficulty, pain in practice is that we try to, instead of try to make it go away or fantasize our way out or whatever the ways out of it, we try to sit with it, right? But there's a way in which I'm guilty of this myself. It's like sometimes I'm sitting with something that is difficult and I'm sitting with you so that you'll go away, right? I'm going to pay attention to you because I hope that you'll go away faster, right? And that's a kind of a move where I got to catch myself, when I'm doing that and be like, okay, am I just trying to be with it so that it'll go away because I'm uncomfortable, or am I being with it because I'm really okay just holding it and being with it, right? And those are different things. There's a qualitative difference. It looks like the same thing from the outside, but if my intent is to make it go away, then it might not, right? It might dig its heels in deeper, right? If it feels like it's not really being allowed to be there, that whatever that feeling is, right? And it's the same thing with depression, right? If I'm working with somebody who's depressed and I really am listening to them and I'm holding it and I'm feeling that kind of feeling that you're talking about, John, of I can feel the despair, right? I can feel it within me, right? Am I feeling it within me because, and just waiting for the next moment to give them something out, a way out? Or am I feeling it and just feeling it and just arriving? And that's part of the work, right? Because we're humans, right? So sometimes I got to check myself. Like, what am I doing here? Am I trying to make it go away?
I think that's the hardest part, though, being able to check yourself. Because it's easier said than done. Because it's like, whenever it pops up, cool, it's coming. I mean, even my client the other day was like, I asked him, like, hey, what does your depression look like? And he said the most interesting thing. He's like, it looks like me strapping myself with like one of those like parachutes to go skydiving, and I'm just going to jump out of the plane instead of riding the full plane ride out. That way I don't need to face any of my feelings. I don't need to, understand or be aware that, hey, maybe I feel pissed off right now. Maybe there's something more about being pissed off that I need to go deeper, but I'm not going to, because I don't want to feel that, or I don't want to experience that, because the safest thing for me to do is escape. And the quickest escape route is sitting next to the exit door next to the plane, so that I can kind of avoid everyone.
One thing in working with adult clients, and this sort of crosses over with a lot of your work, Gia, is that in the best case scenario, even with really well-meaning parents, they don't want their kids to be sad or to feel anything, but often that comes as a negation of what the child is actually experiencing. And in the worst case scenario, kids really being punished for whatever they feel. So then the way the adult internalizes that is that their relationship to their emotional state is automatically not acceptable in order to be loved. So they take the form of that adult in their childhood life that said, no, I'm sorry, you can't feel that, which gets down to everything that Ariel was talking about, and just being there and sitting, not the past, not the future, but really being with what is. I think one of the great testaments to dealing with depression in Western literature is, of course, Dante's Inferno. And, as John and I have talked about, when you enter the gates, it says, abandon all hope, ye who enter here, which I think means abandoning expectation and patterns and simply being in the present. Sometimes, the gift of that is that if we can only think about where we are today, in a way, then the burden of our expectations of the future have been lifted from us in a bizarre way. And so it's actually establishing a relationship with that process that will give us genuine hope for the future, and not just patterned expectations that we've lived with in the past.
Well, and this is the piece, Rodney, that I think is so interesting about the cultural piece. When we say, at least in the US, right, the pursuit of happiness as a fundamental value, what the leading researchers in happiness suggest, this is a Harvard study, is that the single greatest determiner of unhappiness is the pursuit of happiness. So my expectation that I should feel this way, and that's where we get into this confusing piece about hope versus optimism. Two very different things. I mean, to have a hopefulness is, I think, what Viktor Frankl was getting at in Man's Search for Meaning. Like, I yearn for something, I long for something. It's a force and a passion, and I have it in my mind, versus like even blindness of optimism. Like, no, this is all going to be okay. Well, no, it's not. It's going to be miserable and horrible and difficult, and yet you might get out of it, but the experience won't be okay. So there's something about our framework that if my pursuit is happiness and optimism, I'm missing out on a large portion of life. And not only do I miss out on it, I relegate it to something beneath my what I believe to be as valuable. And so when I push something like that out, I start to compartmentalize my interior world into this is good and that is bad. And so any flavor of the bad, I have these defense structures that keep me from moving into those spaces. And I tend to privilege the happy or the positive, which of course sets up a conflict. And one of the symptoms that manifests is what we call depression. Because in a sense, the psyche is saying you're living an incomplete life. And you're not to blame. It is just what's happening to you. And how can you make life more complete? Meaning, how can you begin to expand your awareness of what you're deeming to be admissible into your inner space? And that takes time. I think that takes time and really small steps. Our fantasy is, of course, that we can just medicate. And in some cases, I work with plenty of people who are on a dose of antidepressants, and it's very effective when you're doing the work on turning into whatever helped, whether it's of your own creation or not, whatever helped it kind of bring this pattern to a more familiar place in your way of living.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that in some way, whether it's optimism or what was the other word you used?
Hope.
Or
I don't know what it said. I was talking about optimism and hope. And
hope, right? So hope or optimism. In both cases, there's a certain element of faith, almost, right? We don't like to use that word. It's like a dirty word, right? Faith, maybe for some people, but it's like there's a certain expectation when you assume a certain way of life. Then you're like, what's going to happen, how things will be. It's a certain act of faith, right? To decide if you have plans for tomorrow or for this weekend or for a month from now or for a year from now, that's an act of faith, right? All those things are small acts of faith. We don't like to think of it that way because we want to be rational, but it's like you can switch your worldview. You can decide how you would like, right? And you can work in a therapeutic context on building the resources and putting people around you. It's like it's a complex thing, right? It's not just in therapy. It's also like if you're hanging out with people who are diminishing that, it's going to be really hard for you to break out of that, right? It's just like we also take energy from each other. So it's a complex thing, and we do get a choice. I think we do have a choice in how we want to see the future and see the possibilities inlaid in the reality that we're living in.
To me, there's something around happiness and joy. To me, happiness is sort of like this, it's like a dot on the plot of your life experience. It's a result of a certain set of circumstances, whereas joy is something that you learn to cultivate. It's a muscle you flex and you get better at flexing, and it's more of a participative way to generate those little happiness blips that, but when we're pursuing happiness, it's a setup for failure, but if we can say, I want to cultivate joy in my life, I'm going to build relationships that I know will be beneficial for all parties involved, and therefore we'll all experience happiness. It's this little byproduct. I'm a learner. I love to learn. So I'm going to continue to learn. And that's going to be me strengthening that muscle that helps me cultivate the joy of learning, art, whatever. You could go down any road, but I think it's really important to understand the difference between joy and happiness.
Mm-hmm. And the pathway, that these passages and pathways that we're walking aren't new to our human experience. Somebody's done this before. And when I was doing my graduate work, Jim Hollis was one of the professors, and he's written a number of amazing books. And when Sean Fitzpatrick, my friend, and I, we raised our hand, we were like, hey, but we need some clinical information, like how to work with people, how to connect with people. He said, read the classics. So back to Rodney's point, which is in the early 1300s, Dante Alighieri was writing a book, a very new kind of book called The Divine Comedy. And what had happened to him is he was in a depression. He lost all connection with the Florence court and the family in charge. A new family came in and he was ousted. So he no longer really had his name and his title. And he went into the unknown world. And the book starts, something like, midway through my life, I found myself in the forest dark. And that's the depression, is I'm in this totally dark space. I don't know where to go. The Lucifer figure he named Dis And all those words come to mind of disorientation and dislocation and dismembering and disconnection. And that's the pathway. What he was doing was articulating the descent into this very difficult space, that was not necessarily on fire, it was frozen and it was stuck. So nothing was moving, there was no life. And that to our soul, the part of us that animates us and creates meaning and purpose, that is a terrifying space. But what he's articulating, and what many people have articulated before then and since then, is that our human experience has some kind of patterning to it. And we can read these stories and see these movies and begin to contemplate how those before us have negotiated or moved through these difficult times. And while that is, supportive, we still have to do it. And so oftentimes we seek out something very normal. We join the world and we do what the world does. We live how they want us to live, and we approach each other how they want us to approach them. And what happens is we sacrifice meaningful aspects of our own hearts, and then symptoms manifest. And so what we call a depression, which is something that we want to treat and get rid of, is not that. It's an invitation. And it's because we've had this complete framework that says that thing is bad, and I don't like the way I feel when that happens, and I want to get out of that because it's uncomfortable. But what we haven't done as much of, which is what a dear friend of mine did when her father died, I went to her home and sat with her and sat Shiva, and I saw two things in the home. There was a black curtain over the mirrors, and then black drapes over the television. And I said to them, like, what is this? And they said, well, the black curtain is over the mirror is a reminder that it's not about you. The black curtain is over the television as a reminder not to check out. She did not socialize with us for 1 year because she was mourning. And these religious traditions have built in these ways of processing. That's probably not a great word there, but moving through the process of grief. And it's supported by a community that says, oh yeah, you're in mourning. And they go, great, you're in mourning. I understand. Not why the fuck do you have these things on your curtain or in your mirror or whatnot. Everybody gets it and everybody's aligned. And we know on some level that mourning or grieving does take about a year. When we've lost somebody that we love, I mean, how many of us have been in a relationship for 1 year, and it takes a long time to get over that. So that process of grieving, that a society that says work all you can, status is really important. You need to be productive as much as possible. The idea of retreating into a space where you can actually be with what's happening in your psyche and your body is foreign to us. And so depression is on the rise. Of course it is, right? Because the ways in which we're living our lives aren't allowing the spaces for our hearts to hurt. Because we can love, we hurt. I just think on some level, this is both kind of an individual thing, but it's also a collective thing that we as a culture don't exactly honor the kind of evolving modes of consciousness throughout an individual's life. And I think we just need to do a better job of it.
Yeah, I'd be willing to bet that depression's probably on the rise right now. I mean, it's certainly, we might be able to turn on TV, but several of the other distractions that allow us to just go about another busy day, and we don't have to meet our own little demons who hang out inside of us. They are coming out and we are having to look at them. And so I think it's important for people to know that there's a place, people who can hold these, create these containers, hold the space for them to be where they are. And I haven't really spoken up so much about the acupuncture and Chinese medicine, but, it is important to be where you are. And it's important to know that you can get support and that energy is stuck. You said the word stuck a little bit ago. And it's okay that it's stuck, and it's okay to try to get it to slowly move again with this awareness and consciousness that you're following the arrows and picking up the thread to see what you can find about yourself, about where you're going.
For me, it's also like, it's not just the getting stuck, and it's also like, sort of, we're all kind of talking about this in different ways, but sometimes it's a feedback mechanism that's saying, hey, there's a part of you that you're not filling up the tank, right? You're not you're not bringing fuel into this fire, right? You're not doing the art that gets you going and that refreshes you, and you're not doing, or the singing, or the socializing, or the running, or the right, or the eating properly, right? There's so many ways that we are actually, it's a complex way to be alive. With just being alive is complex, and if you want to be balanced. And so part of when I feel that kind of energy, like first thing is like, go away. But then it's like, God, I don't like you. But then when I'm real, it's like, okay, hey, what are you here for? To tell me, what's the imbalance here? Because I see it as a helpful mechanism. It's telling me, hey, Ariel, you aren't doing a great job necessarily at fueling your own fire. You're not chopping wood, right? You're not doing the things that get you going, that keep you joyous and excited and grateful, right? So how do you start doing those things? What are those things, first of all, if you've never thought of it, right? Start thinking about what are the things that you do that make you excited. They bring you to life, right? They get you going. And then start to put more of those things, especially if they're wholesome things, right? Sometimes those things are not so wholesome, but you got to start somewhere. And then you can start to infuse that into your life as like a prophylactic, right? Like, okay, so I go running, I meditate because it's like, it keeps me balanced, right? Not because I love running, I hate running, right? And I'm not even that good of a meditator, but it's like, it's just like, I do it because it helps keep me up, it keeps me floating. That's why I pray, right? There's lots of reasons to do different things. And when we have that eye on what, how does it fill me up? I think that's important. The other thing I wanted to mention is that, sometimes it really does take, when I'm in a depressed state, and I've encountered this with other people, I gotta be ready to move, right? I gotta be ready to come out of that if I'm gonna come out of that, right? And sometimes readiness is not all that it takes. Sometimes it takes a little bit of extra. But if I don't want to if I like my depressive state, if I'm comfortable there, there's nothing you're gonna say that's gonna get me out of that, right? There's nothing that like, no friend, no spouse, no nothing is going to get me out of that if I don't want to get out of it. If I'm comfortable there, I'm going to stay there as long as I want to. So that's another thing, is got to have a readiness, to come out of it. Recognition that that's where you're at, and a desire to not stay there, which I think is super, super, super important. It's like small, but it sounds small, but it's like, it's actually the linchpin of the whole thing.
The word relationship has been brought up several times, and when Ariel was talking, getting to that place where we're ready to make another a move into life, or whatever that is, or very, very small realistic steps. Establishing a relationship with someone else or with anything means an acknowledgement of who I am, who they are, how we overlap, but how we're separate. And when depression and these things hit, it feels like it is us, it defines us, and there's nothing separate from that. And the more we resist it, the more that remains. And so the irony of establishing a relationship with these feelings, with our depression, with all that, is that then we begin to see that it is separate from us to a certain extent, and that it is a part but not all of us. And it's then, once we have that awareness, and that the seer, the healer, the watcher, whatever we want to call it, once we're able to cultivate that, like Ara would say, in a disciplined way through meditation, then it's that part of us that can begin to make those steps in a different direction.
Yeah, and I think self-compassion, I mean, speaking of relationship with ourselves, I think most of us have an enormous bully that lives inside of ourselves. I mean, imagine if there was an actual person following you around saying to you the things that you say to yourself, or at least that I say to myself sometimes, and so being aware that that is not the truth, and that, like you said, is not the entirety of you. This is an echo in your head that is some part of you that's trying to keep you small.
I had it brings up a thought, Leela Scott. I had a conversation once with a psychological anthropologist named Tanya Lerman. And I stumbled into her because she had written an article in the BBC that noted her research in schizophrenia. And this blew my mind. What she suggests is that when you look at the voices, the hallucinations and delusions that are the hallmarks of schizophrenia, When you look at those in the West, they tend to be harsh, self-judgmental, right? They tend to try to elicit violence to self or others, and they have like a demeaning kind of bully attitude about them. But when you go somewhere else, like in Africa, in more collectivist cultures, and I'm not saying one is better than the other, but this is just simply interesting. What we tend to find is that the voices in schizophrenia tend to be a benevolent relative who's died, and they tend to be supportive and helpful. So there is something about the assumptions that we have, right? In the West, one of the, whether it's democracy or it's, Christianity, like the incarnated, embodied divine, the individual as sovereign and as primary, what can happen is we set ourselves against others rather than being with them. And so the inner other is also something that takes on a certain negative tone because it has been othered here. Yet when we are connected with each other and our assumptions are about belonging and connecting and not kind of and again, I'm not railing on this economic thing, but it's a capitalistic endeavor, which is I've got to get mine and I've got to be productive. Again, we set up a competitive dynamic with others, so we're not as connected. So we have something to learn from being embodied and in relationship in that way that is belonging and supportive. And I've said it to tons of people that if you ever feel like you're about to break down, go across the tracks and help somebody in need. There's something, and even John Bowlby in his research with monkeys, rhesus monkeys in the 40s and 50s, when you had a monkey taken out of its community, it didn't learn all the kind of grooming techniques and languaging techniques that the monkeys had as they were developing. So when the monkeys reintroduced into the population, they will beat it, they will bully it, they will excommunicate it essentially. But what he learned is that when you pair that monkey that had been separated with an infant monkey, the infant starts crawling all over that monkey, and all of a sudden it onboards these instincts about grooming and socialization and being along and apart with somebody else. And there, in those moments, once it's learned that, it can be reintroduced to the community and they will accept it. So we are totally relational. Belonging is one of the most important things that we can, if not the lifeblood of being a human being. And when we cut ourselves off, whether internally cut things off or cut things off externally in our interpersonal relationships, we suffer. And one manifestation is that depression can show up because maybe our upbringing didn't really support those feelings and those expressions of our body.
And we have a choice now, right, to do other than that. Right, because we can't sit here and just blame the past all forever and ever, right? Because we were living now. So yes, it's important to get an understanding from a place of compassion of like how is it that I frame the world in the way that I do? So important, because otherwise I don't know like where to start, right? I need a frame of reference. But then it's also like, okay, my parents also had that, right? We talked about memes. My parents also were downloaded from their parents and their parents and their parents. So you know what? Let me start by giving myself compassion. One of the practices that I found so like maybe one of the most important practices that I've done in my work for myself and for others is I go through a progression of loving myself as an infant, like just imagining myself as that little guy. Because why not, right? That guy was suffering, right? He didn't know how to eat yet. He was, the little babies, they don't even know how to burp, right? So like, there's a lot of discomfort in being a baby. And if you think about just the instance of birth, right? I went from this warm, supportive, completely nourishing environment to this freezing cold, if you were born in a hospital especially, right? Freezing cold, sterile environment where things are sharp, and all of a sudden it's like that's jarring, right? So to bring compassion to myself in those moments and then progressively bring it up to where I am now actually has been in some way like a reprogramming that has shifted the way that I walk through the world completely. Because like you said, it's really important to be able to be that voice for ourselves, especially in the world that we live in. The Dalai Lama, when he was asked one time, was teaching a retreat, and they said, well, what do we do with self-criticism? And he was like, what? The translator, they didn't have the words in his language to translate what that is, because it was such a foreign concept. It was like, why would you not love yourself? It didn't even make sense, right? But in our culture, we do need to do that, right? We need to do that reparative, restorative work of going back and learning how to love ourselves, because we didn't get that from birth. We didn't get that from our culture and our society. It's really important. It's a really important part of this path.
It's funny you say that. I tell patients that all the time when there's a lot of self-criticism, and I try to remind myself, and man, it's hard, but just imagine you as like a 2-year-old. I like to do the toddler stage. Like if that toddler walked up to you saying the things that you're saying to yourself, what would you say to that toddler? You would scoop them up, hug them, comfort them. You know, there's no way you would speak to a 2-year-old the way you speak to yourself. It's important.
Hey guys, we got to start closing it up. What closing thoughts do you all have?
Hang in there.
That conflict ensues growth, right? Whether it's marital conflict, whether it's COVID pandemic conflict, or even if it's as simple as depression, or, well, not simple, but depression or anxiety, right? That there's always going to be something that, as long as you're open and willing to explore to get a better sense of who you are, how you are, and what you want to do with that information moving forward.
I guess the one thought I've got in closing is about suicide. And it's the kind of deepest and most permanent extension of this conversation that we're having. And I think when it comes to when I've been with people who are suicidal, which, by the way, everyone watching, it's common to have thoughts of suicide. It's natural to have thoughts of suicide. It is in one study I read, 80% of people in America, in the US, have periods of time where they contemplate suicide. So if we keep it hidden, right, all of a sudden it's a scary thing when I start to think that way, or if I have that thought. Suicide is an idea, it's an image, and it's part of what happens in our psyche. It's our psyche communicating to us. And so anytime somebody is contemplating suicide, the question that I want to ask them is, what part of you needs to die? We don't need to have a permanent solution for a temporary issue. And of course, then people push back and say, this is permanent. And I say, I completely understand that. And just like the weather, we have weather inside of us. And whether you know it or not, I certainly do, because I've worked with people who've come out on the other side of it. And I've worked with them in their moments of helplessness and how terrifying that is. So I'm not belittling or invalidating the terror that you can feel when you're feeling that. And the trend is that if you begin to contemplate what part of you does need to die, maybe that part of you begins to release. And the hope that we're talking about can begin to emerge. And life can take on a new essence. And you become a new person, essentially. So I think that if anybody watching this, or any of the folks that we've worked with, if you feel that way, the first thing to do is normalize it, to recognize that that happens. It's understandable, and reach out to somebody that can support you, because we are much better when we are connected with people that we care for and that care for us and that we can trust. Any other thoughts? Okay, you guys. Until next week, thanks for joining us today. See ya.